Welcome, everybody. On behalf of the Penn Institute for Urban Research and the Forum of Informality, I would like to welcome you to today's book talk and discussion. I am Kimberly Narona, a doctoral candidate at the Weizmann School of Design and a member of the Forum on Informality. This forum fosters interdisciplinary exchange on informality between early career researchers, including masters and PhD students and postdocs from universities around the world. Just a very quick notice to the audience. This is a webinar, so I invite you to address your questions to the author and the discussants. At the end of the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session where I will field your questions to the panel. We strongly recommend that you type your questions in the Q&A box during the discussions. Please note that the chat function is disabled and we can only take questions in the Q&A box. Now on to the business of the day. We're thrilled to host this book talk on Master Plans and Encroachments, the Architecture of Informality. This is a new book, part of the Penn Press series, The City in the 21st Century, edited in conjunction with Penn IUR. The book examines informality in Islamabad as a strategic conformity to official schemes and regulations rather than as a deviation for them. For those of you who would like to buy the book, Penn IUR is pleased to offer a discount code, which we will put in the chat for you. I'm delighted to welcome the author of the book, Dr. Faiza Moatasim. Faiza is the Assistant Professor of Architecture in Urbanism and Urban Design at the USC School of Architecture. She specializes in the history and theory of architecture and urban design, modern colonial and post-colonial architecture and urbanism, and low-income housing and urban informality. You're in for a treat today. Welcome, Faiza.
Thank you all for being here. Big thanks to Arden Jordan, Kimberly Norona, and the directors at Penn Institute for Urban Research for organizing this event. I'm also extremely grateful to Aasim, Akhtar, and Liza Weinstein for participating in this discussion today. In the time that I have today, I would like to spend some looking at the overview of my book's main arguments. While I don't have enough time to give you detailed examples, hopefully the slideshow can help you visualize some of the processes that I will be describing in my talk. My book investigates the master plan, which, as you may already know, is a state planning instrument from the perspective of informal and encroaching spaces. It shows informality as not an absence of law, but rather an orientation to law. My book highlights how histories of informal and encroaching spaces in Islamabad are deeply enmeshed with formal bureaucratic procedures. I explore this deeply entwined relationship between the formal and the informal by attending to the architectural practices, forms, and aesthetics of informal spaces, and argue that people do not randomly build encroachments. They actually pay a lot of attention to planning rules and regulations. Excuse me, my PowerPoint is a little bit funky today. These arguments in my book are based on an examination of the planning and development of the city of Islamabad, which was created as the capital of Pakistan in the 1960s. Islamabad's master plan was conceived according to the dominant high-modernist planning principles, and high-modernism is a particularly popular planning paradigm at the time, especially in the post-World War II era. In Islamabad, the master plan, which was designed by Greek architect planner Konstantinos Doxiadis, the master plan featured a system of highways that compartmentalized various urban functions into clearly defined zones, namely the Islamabad proper and the National Park area. The Islamabad proper area was planned as a grid of identically organized and arranged neighborhoods called sectors, In contrast, the National Park area was imagined as a large protected nature reserve, a space for leisure and respite in the city. As is always often the case with newly planned cities, spaces that were unanticipated according to the official master plan emerged as soon as the city's construction began. These unanticipated spaces include the quintessential forms of ordinary encroachments like squatter settlements and hawker stalls, and the more unconventional forms of elite encroachments like exclusive gated communities and shopping malls for middle and upper class residents. In municipal administration and public discourse, master plans and encroachments are normatively seen as fundamentally different and separate categories. But when I started my research examining the histories of informal spaces in Islamabad, how they came to be and how they were able to stay in place, I learned that Islamabad's master plan was not simply a blueprint that guides its future development or that makes its violations apparent. It is used both by state and non-state actors to develop new informal spaces that accommodate unfulfilled needs and aspirations of those living and working in the city. In short, Islamabad's master plan and planning laws create, regulate, and are shaped by informal encroachments. In my book, I present examples of bureaucratic procedures that create and sustain ordinary kinds of encroachments like Achiyabadis or squatter settlements and roadside kiosks or kokas. I show how city officials in Islamabad inaugurated the process of informality in this highly planned city. They identified suitable sites according to the master plan to provide land for self-built housing for essential government workers, municipal workers, in places where the master plan would not be, according to them, disturbed. They developed temporary design parameters for roadside kiosks and tea stalls and issued no objection certificates, NOCs, to elite residents for the temporary use of public spaces. The residents and business people of Islamabad similarly rely on bureaucratic procedures to sustain their informal constructions. Roadside coca owners that sell snacks, cold drinks, and cigarettes claim to do their business with ijazat, permission. Owners of elite informal businesses operating from large houses or lavish mansions built in protected areas claimed that they developed their constructions with some form of official permission, such as after receiving an NOC, a non-objection certificate from the city, or at the very least with a tacit knowledge of city officials. In addition to engaging with bureaucratic procedures, the builders of informal and both elite and ordinary informal spaces routinely rely on architectural strategies to create and sustain encroachments in Islamabad. Vendors, hawkers, and middle-class shop owners make claims to public spaces using temporary building practices to appear less illegal. They use temporary building materials and construction techniques and follow rituals of daily assembly and disassembly to create an overall aesthetic of temporariness. This notion of temporariness is apparent in both the spatial practices and bureaucratic procedures that sustain the ordinary encroachments, often for long periods of time. Labeling something temporary creates the effect of tolerance, of making concessions for activities that otherwise would not be allowed permanently. City officials often designate an encroachment as temporary and engage in this creative bureaucratic strategy based on the assumption that temporary violations will be resolved permanently at a later stage, but that stage may never be reached. The material conversion of elite houses into commercial and institutional spaces also reveals that architectural design has played an important role in sustaining elite non-conforming spaces by concealing their commercial/institutional intent. Elite non-conforming spaces appear to conform to official building regulations by creating an impression of adherence to the law. This system of compliance without intent is based on bureaucratic and architectural practices and an aesthetic of conformity to the official use, domestic in this case. Elite and ordinary encroachments are not only regulated and tolerated in existing plans and regulations, occasionally they can displace the laws that declared them illegal. This is well illustrated in the transformation of the national park area from a protected nature reserve into a thriving middle class and elite residential community. Starting in the 1980s, influential residents like politicians, lawyers, civil servants, and senior military officials started building palatial and non-conforming houses on acres of protected land in the national park, where residential construction was strictly prohibited. While the builders of elite mansions and farmhouses were mainly interested in developing large estates within the city limits, their building practices in a protected nature reserve initiated a process of transformation of the national park from a protected parkland into a thriving residential area. Court decisions on elite non-conforming constructions in the national park in 1990s and 2000s legitimized subsequent zoning changes in glaring contradiction to the Doxiadis master plan. The master plan adapted to these changes retroactively because the city's layout had already been changed by non-conforming spaces. So far, I've discussed how master planning in a comprehensively planned city shapes and is shaped by encroaching in informal spaces. But why does planning work in this way in places like Islamabad? The answer has to do with how informal processes effectively respond to changing local and global pressures to field economic and housing challenges of low-income refugees and internally displaced people after the Soviet-Afghan War of the 1970s and 80s and the global war on terror since 2001. Large cities in Pakistan, including Islamabad, have expanded into their adjacent agricultural and rural peripheries to accommodate residential and commercial schemes. Local and foreign capital from China and the Middle East has further fueled peri-urban real estate development in the form of exclusive shopping malls and lifestyle gated communities, which offer quote unquote world-class living to affluent people. The urban sprawl that caters to the upwardly mobile classes in large metropolitan areas is further supported by the interest of many state and non-state actors. These include overseas as well as upper-income Pakistanis who prefer to invest in real estate, mainly urban residential plots. This trend of treating land as a commodity has resulted in overinvestment in Pakistan's urban land market. Consequently, it has contributed to the urban sprawl into the agricultural and rural peripheries of large cities. So in Islamabad, it is the fragmented and informal land development systems rather than centralized master planning that have addressed these mirrored global and local pressures, including the influx of displaced populations, the desires of upper classes to live in exclusive enclaves, local politics, and the financialization of residential plots. Elite and ordinary encroachments are thus outcomes of a system that must reconcile the realities of global and local economic and political pressures, as well as the asymmetries of extreme power and destitution. Without the possibilities offered by informal living and working arrangements, Islamabad would have been even more unlivable for the urban poor. The difficulties and challenges of living in Kachi-Abadis and working as street vendors and hawkers are undeniable. Still, inhabitants of underprivileged communities make deliberate use of ordinary materials and informal practices to earn a living and to find shelter. City officials recognize, however, grudgingly, the necessity of squatter settlements and vendor stalls in meeting the essential needs of housing and livelihoods of low-income populations. They devise bureaucratic procedures that allow low-income residents and business people to sustain themselves under precarious conditions. So it would be simplistic to assume that encroachments in Islamabad represent a failure of the master plan or official ineffectiveness. I argue it is more accurate to see encroachments as part of the concessions and negotiations that must take place to make a city functional and also livable. The same mechanism that makes cities more accessible to marginalized communities, however, are manipulated by wealthy people to further their self-serving interests, which go beyond the basic needs for shelter and livelihood. So to conclude, I want to just mention that cities that work are not necessarily cities that follow the plan. They're places where people want to be, places that sustain various social and spatial aspirations of their inhabitants. Based on the adaptive nature of formal planning framework, the architectural and bureaucratic practices I have examined in my book allow people to meet their unfulfilled essential needs. But the democratic aspect of contingent and flexible city making, which contribute to the inclusivity of cities, can also be co-opted by elites in efforts to accumulate more wealth and power. The challenge is then to devise flexible, contingent ways of city making beneficial for excluded people whose needs and aspirations are generally unmet by institutionalized planning systems. Thank you.
Thank you, Faiza. That was very, very interesting. It is now my distinct pleasure to welcome our first discussant, Professor Liza Weinstein. Liza is the department chair and associate professor of sociology in the Sociology and Anthropology department at Northeastern University. She studies and teaches cities and globalization, urban political economy, and the politics of informality with a regional focus on India. Liza.
Thank you, Kimberly, and thank you, Faiza, for inviting me to discuss your really excellent and rich book today. So, and thank you also to Penn IUR and all for bringing this together across many time zones and allowing many people to participate. So in my brief comments today, I'm going to highlight just a few of the themes and topics that I found so remarkable in this book, many of which Faiza touched on today in her comments. And then I want to dig a bit deeper into three core tensions that I understood as underpinning Deoxydas's particular take on modernist planning, and I think have created some of the historical conditions that have shaped the relationship between the informal and formal in Islamabad, as well as in other locations. So it's about these tensions and their ongoing influence that I hope we can speak a little bit more when Faiza returns to the virtual floor. So first, I must just remark on how much I learned from reading this book. Like most urbanists, I've long been fascinated by the ambitions of modernist city planning and by the hubris of the social engineering on this scale. And I've read about and visited many planned cities, particularly in India. But Faiza's meticulous research and the comparisons she draws between similar projects in Chandigarh, Brasilia, Baghdad, and elsewhere provided me with a much deeper understanding of modernist planning through the reflections she draws on how the particularities of Pakistan and the communities in and around what was to become Islamabad both embodied and diverged from the model. So I also want to note how visually rich the book is, which you actually saw, a bit of a glimpse of in the slides that Faiza just presented. But in addition to her adept use of ethnographic and archival methods, this book very effectively captures her skills in spatial analysis. As I was reading the book, I found myself lingering on the maps and the satellite and overhead images and the many photographs and her accompanying discussions that effectively captured the spatial as well as the social and political relations between the planned city and its informal spaces. So as Faiza explained so nicely, the book argues that in practice, and then she demonstrates through the history and lived experiences of Islamabad, master planning and encroachments are not opposed, but are enmeshed, intertwined, and co-constituted. Unplanned and non-conforming spaces of residence, work, and consumption are in fact products of the plan and can be anticipated by it. Spaces that are later labeled or perceived as illegal encroachments or illegal violations are typically built with some form of official permission. And then these spaces and the process through which they are constructed provides the flexibility required for implementation and adherence to the plan. So throughout the book's 4 ethnographic chapters that go deep into case studies of informal spaces, Faiza demonstrates this entwining of the formal and the informal, the planned and the non-conforming, across various urban forms, functions, and social locations, in residential and commercial places, and among elite and ordinary uses of space. But what I want to kind of hone in on in my remaining time is the historical context, the historical conditions that produced this informality, that demonstrating that the veritable inevitability of informality was due in part to several key tensions or contradictions that underlay the plan itself. Namely, the tensions between the religious and communal divisions emphasized and exacerbated by the British Raj and colonial regimes of control, and the post-colonial ambitions of creating new communities of citizens rooted in place-based solidarities that transcended these supposedly primordial divisions. And secondly, the tension between Doxiadis's insistence that planning should build on what is good in the local context and should only work to enhance or improve upon what is already there, and his professional partiality toward rationality, efficiency, and standardization, which serve to actually overwrite the local context. And then the third tension was between Doxiadis's conceptualization of the city as a dynamically growing organism, or a dynapolis, and the rigidity with which the plan constitutes sectors as relatively stable, self-contained neighborhood units that can manage and ultimately restrain organic growth. So it's in part through these tensions that the contestations over informality that are built into the master plan itself remain ongoing features of life in Islamabad and shape the contestations that Faiza discussed through the 4 key sites that she explores. So first of all, the misguided belief that modernist planning could simply wipe away longstanding social divisions that had been operationalized through British imperialism is laid bare, I think, most strikingly in the chapter on the France colony. In this chapter, we see the tensions between the housing needs of Islamabad's Christian communities of sanitation workers and those engaged in the dirty work of the city and of city management, and then the supposedly temporary Muslim construction workers who had migrated to Islamabad for city building projects. It is in these relations that social hierarchies within the France colony today reveal themselves, in part through the figure of the local chaudhry and the street level bureaucrat, and the uneven claims to property and modes of negotiation with the CDA. These entrenched inequalities appear again in the chapter on the elite neighborhood of Banigala, where longstanding power relations, obscured by utopian ideals of modernist master planning, shape access to both formal and informal property claims. The assumption that longstanding social divisions could simply be replaced by place-based solidarities is also exacerbated by the tension between Doxiadis's commitment to both social preservation and social engineering. This second notable tension reveals the given difficulty, or frankly, the impossibility of pursuing such an ambitious program of social engineering while also retaining what is good and even what is not so good about the local context. Ultimately, the discursive commitment to local preservation has served to distract from the rejection of actually existing forms of placemaking. Path-dependent practices and contextual factors come to be understood as violations and non-conforming uses, and as Faiza explained so elegantly, are products of the plan and the contradictions upon which it is based. And lastly, I was struck by the premise of Islamabad's plan built on organic growth, or the principle of the dynapolis that is so deeply in tension with the rigidity of the plan itself. So as Faiza explained so well in her comments today, the informal uses of space for housing and commerce were responses to the global and local pressures for expansion and growth. But both the premise of the master plan and the plan itself are designed in opposition to Pakistan's earlier form of the mohalla, the piecemeal and gradually evolving form of urban social life. The mohalla, not the self-contained neighborhood units, are actually a much better reflection of Doxiadis's Dianapolis. As I read the book and thought about the growth of Islamabad and the production of spaces not accounted for in the original plan, I was struck by the ways that the cases of urban informality were in fact reflections of the dynamism that Doxiadis recognized as so critical to his idea of human settlement, achistics, but could not actually be accounted for in the plan. So as we open up the conversation and we hear again from Faiza and talk about these themes, I was hoping we could hear a bit more about the degree to which these tensions or others that were built into the master plan in Islamabad or master planning more broadly can be understood as the key sources, as some of the key sources of the informality and the contestations over informality described so vividly in the book. Thank you.
Thank you, Liza. I would now like to welcome our second discussant, Professor Aasim Sajjad Akhtar. He is the Associate Professor of Political Economy at the National Institute of Pakistan Studies at the Quaid-i-Azam University. He works on diverse subjects such as state theory, informality, and class formation, colonial history, and social movements. Aasim, over to you.
Thank you, said to Faiza and to the organizers for having me. A small disclosure as we start. I've known Faiza for a long time, since I think this project was in its infancy, and you know, we met and talked. I live in Islamabad, so we met and talked at an early stage about her at least one of her major research sites, which is France Colony. And the reason I bring this up is because, in a sense, the perspective that I want to share, which I think those of you who will read Faiza's book or haven't read it till now will come across, is that this is also a study. This sort of speaks to my particular interest, both in this book and generally. This is a study about politics, about class, about the way in which spaces are contested. And in a sense, if I had to summarize from a slightly different disciplinary lens, what this book is about, it's about two underlying structural forces. On the one hand, there is colonial statecraft at the heart of this book. And that, to me, includes this high-modernist planning paradigm that Doxiadis brought to Islamabad, or Ayub Khan, the military dictator at the time, envisioned in the creation of a capital city on the foothills of the Margala Hills, and almost like as if there was a clean slate and there wasn't anybody there. And on the other hand, the forces of capitalism, which have transformed the landscape of Islamabad and around Islamabad, the broader forces that Faiza just mentioned as triggering masses of rural-urban migration, and also this process of financialization that has completely changed both in terms of how Islamabad was conceived and imagined by these planners, and how land and its value and its use has metamorphosed, basically, since, frankly, all over the world since the 1970s. We've seen the explosion of sectors like real estate. So these two, interlocking processes are at play in this book, and they're most sort of, in a sense, acutely described or shown in this contested politics in these two sites of a squatter settlement, France Colony, and on the other hand, Banigala, this elite sort of site. Now, I think Faiza puts it very nicely, and sort of almost too nicely, when she describes it as contestation. This is brazen class war playing out in a city that ostensibly is supposed to be the federation, the capital of the federation, is supposed to represent the aspirations of all of its people. But in truth, what Faiza was describing as the issuing of no objection certificates to these elite spaces to encroach or to sort of change up or to sort of, in a sense, transcend the master plan is not a liberty or not sort of a nicety that is issued to the Kokawalas or to the Kachi Abadi dwellers who never get no objection certificates, or at least many of them don't. They are at best tolerated through, as was noted, through a process of give and take where the state bureaucracy allows them to build. And then at subsequent stages, most of them, not France colony per se, but many such squatter settlements in Islamabad, and this has increased over the years in recent times in particular, they are brutally demolished when the rule of law is invoked to describe these places of encroachment. So what Faiza describes as ordinary encroachments are not granted the same liberties to continue surviving. So there is an ordinariness that allows them to contest that larger sort of process of colonial statecraft. But more often than not, they come out on the losing end. And this applies also to the kokas or to the temporary, the street vendors and so on and so forth. And that's happened a lot more in recent years with the CDA. And this, by the way, applies also in cases in the recent past where a certain number of licenses were also issued to street vendors by a previous government, the PTI government. And as soon as that government was deposed actually in 2022, the CDA not just revoked those licenses, but literally bulldozed all of those street vendors in a number of major marketplaces in the city. So this is brazen class war, and this combination of colonial capitalism, I think, comes out in this book in I think very profound ways, in very molecular ways, even down to the level of the street, as I think Liza was just pointing out, that within France colony you see how certain middlemen, local middlemen, are not in cahoots with the state as much as sort of collude with the state to facilitate these ordinary encroachments, but just as often will then collude with the state to dispossess those who do not, who fall foul of legality. And I really appreciate the way in which Faiza has sort of problematized the legal illegal continuum, and the way in which law is very instrumentally deployed, invoked to reinforce these class logics, these colonial logics. I'll just give you a couple of sort of important, I think, sort of further details, just to give you a sense of the scale of these contradictory processes and pressures. In 1998, Islamabad had a population of 800,000 people, according to the census. We had a census, well, formally 3 years ago now, the results of which are yet to be published, but Islamabad's population is now upwards of 2.5 million. So we're talking a threefold increase in the space of 20 years. And the vast majority of these incoming migrants are, as Faiza noted, forced migrations from war-torn regions, but also more generally, forced migrations as the agrarian sectors simply cannot absorb the numbers of people that we see in rural Pakistan. There's a mass migration into cities like Islamabad, and that is resulting in what Mike Davis famously called the proliferation of almost a planet of slums. But these slums are perpetually subject to these coercive forces that dispossess them. And this is, and the only thing, they'll close with this, and the only thing that prevents and sort of in a sense pushes back is some kind of organized political associations, of which I've been a part for many years, which sort of contests the ability of completely bureaucratic colonial institutions like the CDA to dictate terms on the basis of, when they feel like it, invoking a master plan and the rules and the zoning bylaws of that master plan. But of course, as Faiza very beautifully notes, completely turning a blind eye to when it happens in Banigala or when it happens in the case of a big commercial plaza. And I should note, in Pakistan's case, when it particularly in this contemporary Islamabad, there's an enormous, right on the foothills of the Margalas now, in what's so called the E sector, is an emergent new headquarters of the army, which is willfully dispossessing both indigenous villages and, you know, the everyday Kachi-Abadis and Kokas that Faiza has documented. So I congratulate her for putting this all down on paper, and I look forward to being able to take some of these sort of observations further.
Thank you so much, Aasim. Before we start the audience Q&A, I just wanted to invite Faiza to respond to any of the comments that you heard today before we take them.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Liza and Aasim. This was a lot. I have like 5 pages of notes scattered around, and I look forward to thinking more deeply about them later on. But for now, I just want to like comment on 2 things. One, Liza, you mentioned use the word tensions, and I really love that because when I think about high modernist planning, one of the premise of high modernism is the simplification of complex urban realities. And so to say that it is also in many ways creating or facilitating the tensions that you so wonderfully highlighted between different things, because that's what life is, that's what urban life entails. It's complex, is a really interesting critique of high modernist planning, which attempts to simplify things into like categories that could be reorganized, and so on. And so like I think it helps build the argument that embedded within the master plan and the high modernist planning ideology are these tensions, even as it attempts to simplify very complex processes. So I'll just leave it at that because there's just so much more I could add, but I know that we're going to end soon, so just want to move on to one of Aasim's comments. So yes, Aasim, I agree 100%. I am too easy. On the elites in the book, I did not. I wish I love your usage of the term brazen class war, and that's exactly what's happening. I think the one thing that I was trying to capture in the book was to show that even despite this situation of unequal class relations, where the wealthy and the privileged get away with anything, while rules and other things are applied more, or while it's the underprivileged that end up getting marginalized or dispossessed. While all of that is true, even within that situation, people are able to build a koka or build a shack. Obviously, it can be displaced, it can be demolished, it can cost obviously a lot to the person who is building these structures. But I'm really inspired by the fact that people are able to come back over and over and over and over again, despite being forced to operate in this very unequal environment. And that is what I was interested in learning about, that, how is someone whose needs are not being met by the state able to bounce back despite being dispossessed continuously? And you use the word organizing, and that made me think about France colony and other informal settlements that were allowed that sort of were settled in the initial phase in the 1970s. Organizing was a big part of it, even though I don't explicitly talk about this, but it was the organizing that allowed CDA workers to find negotiate a spot for themselves in the city, at the time under construction city, like in more central areas, as opposed to being kicked out to the peripheries, which is what happened in the I-11 Kachi-Abadis and that part of like other Abadis that were on the peripheries. And that is exactly what has helped a place like France colony sustain itself. So yes, organizing is super important. I just want to second that, but for me the objective was to understand how does one figure out a way to earn a living or to house oneself and their families in a situation where the system is essentially working against you. So with that, I'll just stop.
Thank you, Faiza. Could I invite Liza and Aasim to turn on their videos? I would encourage, we're now going to move to the discussion part of this, so I invite the audience to put your questions in the Q&A box. Once again, for those of you who would like to buy the book, Penn IUR is offering 30% off with that code that is in the chat. It's an excellent book. I read it. I was fixated with it. I'm quoting it in my dissertation. I'm telling you right now. I have a question to start us off while people are getting in this. So, I'm always fascinated by taking of the results back to the field. You've had time to sit with it, you've churned it, and obviously you've made presentations at various academic fora. I was wondering if you'd had the chance to present these findings to planners, because as Aasim said, this is very clearly a class war. And what, if any, were the planners' reactions to your results of them saying yes to one side with permits and no to the other side?
So the book came out in fall, in October. So I haven't had a chance to visit Pakistan yet, but that is definitely on the cards. I'm also waiting for the book. Anyway, I don't have to get into the details about what else needs to happen before I present to the local planning authorities. But what I would say is that as I was doing research, I spent a lot of time with CDA CDA being the Capital Development Authority, which is a corporate planning development authority of Islamabad. So I spent a lot of time with their planners, just discussing various aspects of the master plan. And one planner, a young planner, she actually had a really profound comment that made me think about how I was observing other planners discuss and how they were describing spaces of informality. And her response was, we assume that there's somehow, I think, because CDA is a planning authority and they have this master plan, that they would feel some kind of moral responsibility to uphold the master plan and really implement it as intended. They're very well aware that things are not working as they should be. In fact, they are responsible for many of these things, many of these processes being the way they are. And so her response was that, we don't think about the master plan so much. And I was, it was obvious, why she said that, but I was taken a little bit aback at the time because I was like, oh, wait, yeah, why should she? Even though she's working for the development authority. So just to say that, I mean, I would, love to report back after I have had a chance to share this work in Islamabad. But my guess is that it is going to be something that they know very well. They're instituting these systems, and they're very much interested in not keeping the master plan the way it was designed in the 1960s. And I think it's, there could be discussion about, the rationality of not sticking to one plan that was built, that was just that was conceived 50, 60 years ago. But then obviously there are these other things like class-based preferences that need to be obviously critically examined.
Liza and Aasim, I'm actually quite interested to hear about your work as that parallels her experience, Faiza's experience, and if you could respond to the same question from the point of view of the work and research that you have done.
Yeah, I'm awesome. So yeah, what I was going to say kind of touches on my work, but also brings in a question I had for Faiza as well. In the absence of adherence to a plan, or the sort of the more tenuous relationship that local planners have to sort of a guiding set of principles that sort of guide the public engagement, I think that there's, and what I found in my work is that creates an opening for the private sector and for developers to sort of exploit what the state sort of claims is an inability to respond to the local and global pressures through formal planning mechanisms. And so ultimately what I think becomes a ceding of control to private developers, to investors, to direct construction and development in the city. And and that was one of the things that I found in my work on informality in Mumbai was really what seems to be an increasing sort of opting out by the state, or a willingness to hand over the tools of development and planning to private developers to extract profits, that I think further exacerbates these class tensions and these class warfare in such a significant way, because it sort of casts aside a more noble, although unrealistic, set of ideals that underpinned rational planning, this kind of high modernist planning that, for all its faults, was aspirational and had a sort of set of goals and objectives that I think as more and more of the planning functions do seem to be taken over by private developers, seem to have been cast entirely to the wayside. And so I wondered if Faiza sort of observed that, so there's the informal practices, the encroachments that are a response to the pressures, but to what degree in Islamabad are there also kind of this ceding of planning powers to the private sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think Aasim has written a really fantastic article on that question of financialization of urban peripheries in places like Islamabad. And yes, I mean, to just quickly answer your question, there is a ceding of power, but also in Islamabad, because it's the federal capital, it has a very distinct municipal administration system. I mean, if I could say this, almost like a generalization, there hasn't been a real elected representation at the highest level in Islamabad. So Capital Development Authority is like this hyper bureaucratic organization that controls much of what happens, at least at the official level in the city. But so there is very much a central role that the government and state officials and authorities play in Islamabad's development, because of the nature of the city as being this capital city. And the military actually is also very heavily involved in opening up new parts to for like elite and middle class housing developments. And including them in the official federal capital territory. And so while, of course, there are private actors and private developers that are very much involved in the construction of new residential societies and housing schemes in this formally protected nature reserve area, the state and the military is also quite actively participating. And I think it has to do more with the fact, I think the difference here would be between Mumbai and Islamabad would be that Islamabad is a capital city. I suppose Delhi would be the comparison that you could think about, where, so it's not a complete, sort of a retreat of CDA from these affairs, but definitely coming up with partnerships with different types of elite actors, state, non-state, and using land as a way to, further, with their own interests, their private interests.
Yeah, I'll just put in a word there just
Sure.
to reinforce that. I think that's exactly right. I think just like the legal-illegal continuum, which, in very classical Marxist fashion, I would rather call it dialectic. I mean, I think state and capital are to be seen dialectically. I don't think it's either or. Frankly, even the high modernist times, I don't think said very much for actual people. whatever the aspirations were, they were very colonial aspirations. They were not aspirations that met the needs of either the villagers in Islamabad or the migrants who came in and constructed it. They were still shunted off, and as Faiza noted, at best through their own organizing efforts, not through any grace of the state, through their own organizing efforts, got like a small nal. By the way, on a nala, I think if you've read her book, they're not even settled on flat lands. They're settled on a natural drain, i.e., a place where you couldn't build a plaza or a big mansion and sell it off for money. And I think that process, those processes have just been exacerbated via financialization. So now what the CDA is doing is it spends all of its time auctioning off whatever remaining plots of land have not been developed or sectors that are what they call yet to be developed. And what's interesting about this is that includes all of those areas that were earlier acquired, what they call acquired lands, but they did not possess those lands. And Faiza also notes this in the book, that they acquired those lands for not even suboptimal market rates, like a pittance back in the 1960s. And now that land, of course, like costs a fortune. And they dispossess the villagers now and they sell it off. So state functionaries have a big stake in all of this process. They're certainly not handing over this process to private capital. It's a nexus of capital and state. And in Pakistan, as I noted, and Faiza just agreed with, that includes the military in particular, which is itself a big real estate developer. So it's like a blurred line. As Faiza said, formal, informal, legal, illegal is a blurred line. The state capital sort of binary is best thought of as sort of a dialectical relationship and mutually reinforcing. And that's why, for me, to use the signifiers of colonial and capitalist is very meaningful to describe this.
I'm going to use my host's privilege to suggest that we go over a little. There are two really interesting questions that I would like to pose to the panel. The first one is from Professor Jeannie Birch. She asks, have you thought about comparing this plan with other planned capitals? She mentioned in a second comment, Brasilia, Abuja, Sejong City. And I believe in your book, you have touched on Brasilia and Chandigarh, but I wonder if you'd like to respond to that.
Hi, Professor Jeannie Burt. Nice to meet you finally. Yes, so this project, when I started my PhD, I thought it would be like a comparative study between Islamabad and Chandigarh, but I have a long story as to why that couldn't happen. It has to do with my Pakistani nationality. And so that dream always remains to compare to high modernist cities, because I think they're really interesting places. They are unique in their context, but it's amazing to see how similar they are across different territories. So if you go to Brasilia or if you go to Islamabad, even though they're like worlds apart or different, I guess, parts of the world, there's something very unifying in the way you can experience those cities, and that has to do, I think, a lot with their high modernist origins. And so, yes, the dream is always there and the goal is always there, but for pragmatic reasons, I couldn't do this. However, I think if I could just add one small comment here, one thing that I found really, interesting and like somewhat different in Islamabad's case was I was doing research early on in my PhD studies at the Doxiadis archives in Athens. And up until that point, I had read critiques of high modernist plannings as type of framework that completely disregards the needs for low-income workers, and that's what happened in Brasilia, for instance, with the satellite cities being built for the city workers outside of the master plan city, and then Chandigarh as well. I knew that there are informal settlements that accommodated at some point, at least from my understanding, low-income communities. And so I had that perception of high modernist architects being completely oblivious to the needs of housing needs of workers. But at the Doxiadis archives, and I mentioned this in the book as well, I was really surprised to see that how Doxiadis was actually quite well aware of these situations. And in his documents, his reports to the city officials in Islamabad, he was trying to convince them to build housing for all of the workers, including day laborers and municipal workers. And he also developed apartment blocks for them in different sectors. But then, those were never implemented. So I think if there was a way to do a comparative study, I think one could look at these questions and see, how the master plan, even though under this high modernist planning ideology is quite similar, there are attempts that were made, at least in the case of Islamabad, to house low-income workers. But then obviously bureaucracy, and I think in Islamabad, the development authority did not think it was worth, as Aasim was saying, to build housing for these really destitute people, when they can self-settle along a drain, open drain. So I don't know what else I could say about that, because I wish I could do that comparison, but I haven't been able to. But yeah, it would be really a fruitful and productive study if someone were to do that.
Okay, we have another question from Zainab Javed. I'm going to summarize it, but it's actually a very important question. He asks the entire panel whether the speakers would agree that perhaps the resilience of these communities owes to the irony that the members of these informal communities are integral to the economic processes of the cities. So you don't like them, but you can't get rid of them, I guess is his question. And that tension is very important for the recognition of informality, or the putting it to one side. So how would you like to respond to that?
It's pretty simple. It's pretty instrumental. When you need it, so Faiza makes this very important distinction where she documents both how Christian sanitary workers and then Muslim construction workers. And it's very instrumental because the Christian sanitary workers are the ones who are going into the mansions and to the offices to clean up. I wish I could actually use the word, because that would really describe how these planners and these bureaucrats think, that they need them to clean up after them. But the ones who have already constructed their buildings and who are now, can be discarded, can be shunted off either to the peripheries or just shunted. In 2015, in a mass eviction, which I was physically present in I-11 sector, this is a very interesting case that just sort of totally documents this. This was right next to the Sabzi Mandi, which is the vegetable market of the city. And these were all Pashtun migrants. So basically what Faiza documented, people coming into the city during the original Afghan Jihad in the 80s, and then some also after 2001. And these are all on the periphery of the city, and this is now a periphery that is being financialized and where new housing schemes are being envisioned. And so they were shunned. They were basically, I remember the CDA member of state stands across from me and says to me, well, I'll give them buses and send them back to their villages. And the reason for that is because they're not needed in the city anymore. But those who are needed as sanitary workers, so it is very instrumental. It is very much a case of when and who do we need for what purpose, and when we don't, they are illegal, they are encroachers, they are, in I-11's case, in the 2015 case, they were actually straight up, they were Pashtun, they were ethnically profiled, and they were said, these are all terrorists. I mean, it was that blatant and that brazen.
Yeah, just to echo that briefly, that Faiza does such a lovely job of talking about this temporary permanence, or this long-term temporariness, and acknowledging temporality, that there's a need to be served, and that people are disposable once their need is served, but the permanence of their presence in the city demonstrates their integral nature to the functioning of all economic life and social life in the city.
We have a very interesting question from an anonymous attendee. He or she says, we've seen some Supreme Court activity to enforce the master plan and an extensive anti-encroachment drive, at least in Karachi, that person is more familiar with. The question, do you see any political movements to better recognize informality?
I think Aasim should be the one answering this question. I would just quickly, because he's like rooted in the middle of all the political organizing in the city. I think one quick comment I would make is over the course of the period that I've examined Islamabad's planning and its development and the various policies for informality, I've noticed that, I mean, I'm sure this is not new, like everyone who works on such contexts probably has the same observation. But in Islamabad, for instance, it's really been, over the course of time, the policies keep changing. And so one government will come up with like a sort of pro-poor policy. They will start, like in the case of France colony, which is a squatter settlement, there was a period where it was the end of 1990s where it seemed like something was going to happen. There was like all this activity and sort of policy formulation that was moving toward giving people titles to land property. But then, as is often the case with many things in Pakistani political context, that sort of abruptly it sort of was abandoned, that project. And so even if there have been attempts, they've been really inconclusive. But over various periods of time, there have been attempts that I would just say that no more than attempts to formalize or to regularize informal spaces. One other comment I would say that even with those attempts, I think the goal is always to formalize something that's already informal, but there's never really any concerted effort that I've seen towards ensuring that the needs of people are met in advance, so that you're not retroactively formalizing in something that has already been done informally. And so that, to my mind, I don't think has ever happened in Islamabad, but I will let Aasim respond as well.
Yeah, real quick. I mean, just to historicize that a little bit further, in the 70s, what Faiza documents with France colony, there was something called the Awami Rihaishi Tanzim, which literally means the People's Housing Committee or organization that was very, very active in Lahore, actually, at the time, also in Karachi, in and around Rawalpindi and the twin city of Islamabad. And then we, myself included, around the time that Musharraf came to power and was bulldozing a lot of Kachi Abadis on railways lands, we created something called the All Pakistan Alliance for Kachi Abadis, which drew on that legacy of the Awami Rihaishi Tanzim and brought together slum dwellers across big cities. And, as Faiza was noting, the CDA also paid some attention to us at the time. There's a couple of pro-poor bureaucrats. One of them, most famously, his name was Tasneem Siddiqui, who had worked in Sindh. And then so there's these sine curves, and that directly corresponds to the level of organization and the amount that there's being pushed back. On its own, the state is not interested. And now with what Liza was talking about, like the role of the growing financialization of land and private developers, now it's completely not interested, because even a small sort of square foot of land in the city is worth billions. So why would you want to regularize it and give it to some, or subsidize it and give it to some slum dweller? And in 2015, this particular eviction, after which got a lot of traction because we tried to resist it, the Supreme Court took it up, and again, the CDA was called into the court. And they asked us to even put together a legislation for Islamabad that corresponded to what existed in Punjab and Sindh, where there are Kachi Abadi Regularization Acts. But we also pushed at the time to say, yeah, we'll do that. And we did that. Of course, 16 or 18 months later, nobody cared anymore about all the work we had put in. But at the time, we also said, as Faiza noted, that this is not just about the existing stock of slums and squatter settlements in the city. It's about this mass migration. I gave you that statistic, 800,000 people 20 years ago and 2.5 or 3 million today. It's the fastest growing urban center in the country, faster growing than even Lahore or Karachi is right now. But there's no planning, zero planning for, low income housing moving forward. And we gave some simple proposals to say, okay, if you're giving land out to private developers, compel them to allocate 20% of that land for low income plots, which either are not marketable or not subject to speculative pressures, because that's exactly how ostensibly low income plots become inaccessible. But no matter how many great proposals you give, it requires political will, and the political will doesn't come from above. It only ever happens when there's some kind of movement from below. So that has a more of a sine curve type dimension to it, rather than some kind of linear sort of movement in a more progressive direction.
One last question from Vinay Gidwani. He looks forward to reading the book and thanks Liza and Aasim for their comments. He's wondering if you could comment more on the role of fixers or brokers. I think you did touch upon this a little bit at various locations within society and state apparatus in facilitating ordinary encroachments, evictions, persistence by working class immigrants. And he's thinking here of the stories in Lisa Bjorkman's edited collection, The Bombay Brokers.
Thank you, Vinay, and a big fan of your work as well. So thanks for joining us. Yes, so yes, definitely in France Colony, we see that a lot. For instance, I talk about this, well, there's several characters, but basically even people who claim to be community organizers, some of them are in ways, street level bureaucrats. They have very good relations with the officials, CDA staff, CDA staff. They sort of keep an eye for them. When appropriate, they may even file a complaint with CDA staff about an encroachment within the settlement. But at the same time, they can also make things happen. And so yes, so there are these fixers that take on. They have different kinds of roles, different types of fixers. There's one person that I met who provided electricity on a contractor base. What's the term? Like a contractor-based electricity for the people who could not get electricity more formally. There's a long process involved, and I can go into the detail there, but there's someone who's providing electricity to some people within the colony that could be seen as a broker. So there are several brokers like that. But I was also thinking about, in reading your questions, also thinking about brokers for the elites. And so while, of course, we have this fantastic book that Bombay Brokers that talks about brokers, but I think an interesting parallel is what I observed in the case of Banigala and the kinds of people who were facilitating the development of that neighborhood. Many were wealthy people. They were friends of wealthy people, and they could call on their connections to get things done. So for instance, in France Colony, in Banigala, which is the elite neighborhood, my protagonist, she calls her friend, who then allocates funds to be diverted this was for phone connections. So the funds were diverted from another part of the city to Banigala, so that this lady and her friends could get phone connections. And so we have these broker type characters, which are not your low level, street level kind of individuals, but they're actually very wealthy, influential people who are in the business of getting things done for friends. And I think Banigala would not have been possible in the 80s and the early 90s, the wealthier part of Banigala, had it not been for the connections that these very wealthy and influential people had with bureaucracy, with military, with even political parties. So yes, so I think it's a really important part. I don't explicitly talk about this, but yes, I see this. I noticed that everywhere I went, and all the case studies that I documented.
Thank you. We are well over time, so I think we can close here. But as you can see from the discussion, this has been an excellent book, something that I think that a lot of us who do any kind of studies of cities should be reading and at least engaging with in some way. It remains for me to thank the Penn Institute for Urban Research, to thank our speakers and the panelists, Faiza, Aasim, and Liza. Thank you very much for coming. Aasim, our special thanks to you. I know it is way past 10 p.m. there. So thank you, and thank you to our audience, especially those who stuck with us through this last 10-15 minutes of Q&A. We look forward to inviting you to subsequent sessions that we have at a later stage. Thank you very much, and goodbye, everybody. Have a great day or evening.
Thank you, everyone.